Hey there, my name is Joel. I've done a lot of videos talking about why drums sound the way they do, the physics involved in some cases, and just, things like the mass of a shell, the effect that that has on the tone of the drum, things like bearing edges, plastic wrap, does that affect the sound of the drum, and how drum heads, all the various types of drum heads. I've done snare and bass drum tuning videos. I've done videos talking about tone wood, things like that. So now let's talk about the factors that separate good drums from not so good drums, or expensive drums from cheap drums, right? Or great drums from crap drums, right? What are the differences that separate those? And while good quality drums tend to be more expensive than not so good quality drums, that doesn't mean that crazy expensive drums are going to be like way better quality than, just good drums. That's not necessarily the case because there is a margin of diminishing returns. There are things like, gold-plated hardware. Well, that's going to be expensive. Is it going to make it a better drum? No. How about an exotic veneer on the outside and a really great, paint job or stain job or something exotic and expensive? It was costly. It took a lot of time to execute or whatever. And there's labor charges related to all of that and material charges related to all of that. And so that can also make the drum very expensive without really making it a better instrument. It's not going to record any better. It's not going to sound any better. It's not going to feel any better when you play it. So there is a margin of diminishing returns. So I really want to focus on the actual practical differences between an inexpensive or not so good drum and a good quality musical instrument. I have here with me a snare drum. It is the cheapest wood snare drum I could find on Amazon. And I've actually seen this exact drum featured in some other videos, sort of like I bought the cheapest snare drum and the most expensive snare drum I could find on Amazon, and then they do a comparison. Or they buy like the cheapest snare drum they can find, and they do hundreds of dollars of upgrades to see, how it sounds. Does that improve the drum? But more often than not, I see drums like this sort of featured in videos where people are talking about how can you make cheap drums sound better. And usually it comes down primarily to drum heads, get new drum heads, get some new snare wires if it's a snare drum, and then tune it. And so I'll show you how to tune it and put some good heads and wires on it, and your drum's going to sound a whole lot better. And that's totally true. It's totally valid. This is not that kind of video. Two things I want to do here. First of all, I just want to kind of talk about what the differences are just sort of generically between cheap drums and nicer drums, and then specifically one aspect. So I'm going to start with the obvious things, such as the material it's made of. This is poplar. Poplar is very soft, very lightweight wood. It's very plentiful. It's very inexpensive. A lot of entry-level drums that you see have poplar shells. Now, that does not mean poplar is a bad wood. There are things about it that I don't love as a player because its softness kind of gives a mushiness, kind of a spongy feel to the drum, to playing the drum. The response just doesn't feel quite as crisp as a harder, denser wood does. But in terms of sound quality, poplar is just a different kind of wood. One thing that is practical to think about is the fact that poplar is very soft. On the Janka scale, I think it's 540, I think is what it is, compared to maple, which comes in like at 1450, sugar maple. So sugar maple is like 3 times as hard as this. And so what that means is if you put a sharp edge on a poplar shell and you crank the tension on your heads up, there's a good chance that tension is going to be breaking down the fibers of the wood along that edge, particularly if it's a sharp edge that's got very little actual mass along that apex of the edge. So that's going to be breaking down. Your edge is going to become uneven. It's going to be hard to tune, things like that. So if you're going to use a poplar or any other lightweight soft wood for your drum shell and you want to have higher tension, you should probably put a round edge, something that's not going to collapse quite so easily under the tension. But that's kind of an aside. So this is poplar. It's an inexpensive material. It's great for making a drum where the price is king, right? Cost is king. This is a $45 drum. That's what I paid for it. So brand new $45 drum. Poplar shell. What else? The hardware, super lightweight, really lightweight. These lugs look like the old pearl lugs, kind of the shape of them, but they're not cast. This is like sheet metal that's been formed in a mold. It's been pressed in a mold around a form or a structure, a subassembly somehow, that has the threaded inserts on it held in place with a spring. They do not have bosses that, like, the boss is the little part on a cast lug that actually has the threads, and usually it sticks out from the lug. and is recessed in the holes that are drilled into the drum shell. So the bosses actually carry some of the tension. This, not so. This is totally flat and has screws that hold it in place. So those screws get loose, this lug's going to slide back and forth. Not so with nicer lugs. Plus, because it's just sheet metal that's kind of holding this thing together, if you put really high tension on it, there's a good chance that stuff's going to start to split. So again, we're not talking very durable. Lightweight, not very durable. The strainer. This strainer, it's a lever strainer. It works. I'm not going to replace any of this hardware, by the way. For this video, I'm using this hardware. I am going to mess with the drum, but I'm keeping the hardware. This lever works, but it's not smooth. It kind of grinds. And the knob, like when it's engaged, you can't really tighten it. You have to kind of disengage it to manipulate it. You know, not so good. Snare wires. They're not all the same length. And if they were when they were soldered to the end clips, they're either not now or the ones on the edge are kind of stretched out. So that means this thing is going to rattle no matter how you set the tension on the wires. Oh, the hoops. The hoops, incredibly thin. I've never seen hoops this thin. I am certain that with higher tension, they will actually buckle. In fact, the way I've got it tensioned right now, they are, in fact, buckling a little bit, right, at the key rods. Yeah, and the TuneBot setting I have for this top head right now, you can see I've already been playing it. I've got some tape up here to muffle the stock coated head. But the tension I have on it right now, I believe, is 265. That's what the TuneBot reading is, and the bottom is 380. So not as tight as I would normally go. I'm closer to 400 typically on the snare drum. If you watch my snare tuning video, you know that. But frankly, this is a brand new head, and you can see that the tension of this, the hoop is almost as low as the bearing edge. These heads are really cheap, super cheap, no-name Asian-made heads. They are stretchy. They don't feel good when you play them. So cheap material, cheap hardware. And the last thing, and the thing I'm really going to spend most of the time in this video talking about, is what I call fit and finish, but really it's craftsmanship, either poor or non-existent craftsmanship in inexpensive drums. And poor craftsmanship because you have to, cut the shell to dimensions. You have to form the shell. You have to drill the shell for hardware. You have to route the edges. You have to work and machine the shell. Typically, the quality of that work is not as good on an inexpensive drum. And there are things that are done on more expensive drums that aren't done at all on inexpensive drums, such as finishing the interior. Quality drums, they sand the interior and then they seal it, whether it's with some kind of a lacquer or polyurethane or tung oil or some other kind of finish, they'll seal the wood. And that actually puts kind of a hard finish on top of the wood, even if it's not a shiny, glossy finish. It may not reflect light. It might be a matte finish, but it actually seals the wood and gives the wood a harder surface. And so the sound waves inside the drum are going to be bouncing around, and they're going to reflect like the higher frequencies, which would normally be absorbed quickly by porous wood, particularly not very dense wood like poplar. Those high frequencies are going to be absorbed into the wood very quickly, and even with harder woods like maple, if you don't finish the interior, it's going to mellow the high end of the drum, so you're not going to get the life and the sense of life and energy out of the drum tonally that you would get otherwise. But you seal that, it gives a hard finish, and those high frequencies bounce around a little more. They hang out a little bit more before they're diffused, and so it changes the timbre of the drum. It's not just like taking an EQ and turning up the high end a little bit, making it brighter. It's not so much that as much as it is the sound waves. You're actually changing like the time domain characteristics of the drum, if you will. And so the whole timbre just changes and the drum comes to life. So that's never done on inexpensive drums, and even middle of the road, semi-pro drums or whatever. Most of those still that I've seen, there's no finish. It's just bare wood on the inside. And oftentimes, if it's a middle of the road drum, it's usually very inexpensive wood that makes the majority of the shell. And then the inner ply is a finish ply. It's something that looks nice. They'll use like basswood because it looks sort of like maple with a less existent grain. It just, but it's a pleasant looking wood, looks nicer than Luan does. So they'll put that on the inside because it looks nice. So when you put clear heads on the drum and you're looking at the inside, it looks like a quality drum. Well, it's a very soft, porous wood and it's not sealed. So it's just sucking up the high frequency energy from the drum. And other non-existent things are things like sanding the edges and finishing the edges and, matching the snare beds. They may cut snare beds, but are they symmetrical? Are they I've seen some drums where the snare bed, you got one here, and then rather than having it 180 degrees, it's a little off center or something, just things like that. It's got snare beds, but they did a crap job installing them, right? So just doing those types of things. So this particular drum has snare beds, and they're exceedingly, in fact, I don't know that I've ever seen narrower snare beds on a drum ever before. They're exceedingly narrow, and maybe that's because they were using 12-strand wires, which is saving them money on material. Roughly half the strands of a 20-strand set over thousands of drums, they're saving money. But narrower beds takes less time, it's less labor involved, but it makes this drum behave not so good. But anyway, before I commence to modifying this thing, I just want to give you kind of a picture of where it is now. So I've got this thing tuned up. I'm going to record it as is. Then I'm going to do what most people do when they want to improve the quality of an inexpensive drum, and I'm going to put nice heads on it. So I'm going to put my standard Aquarian texture coated on the top and classic clear snare side on the bottom. And I will put some other snares on because these are either stretched out or they just were not evenly cut, because these outer ones are just rattling like crazy. So there's no way really to keep the snares on this drum from rattling somewhat. But I've got some 12-strand pure sounds that I might put on, or 20-strand. I'm afraid that 20-strand snare wires are actually as wide as the very, very edges of this snare bed. So I'm pretty sure those outer strands are not going to make good contact with the head, and they'll be rattling too. So anyway, no matter what wires you put on this, you're probably going to get some rattling just because of the narrowness of the snare beds. But I'm going to widen the snare beds, and I'm going to have Jon Zoog recut the bearing edges. And things like gluing the plastic wrap. I guarantee, I haven't looked yet, but when I take this thing apart, I guarantee there's going to be 2 pieces of tape, or adhesive really, not so much tape, but 2 strips of adhesive holding this on. One at the seam where they applied the wrap to the shell, and they wrap it around, another piece to overlap and stick it on there. Then they drill the holes, mount the hardware holds it on, all that kind of stuff. That's cost saving. That saves money. And it saves money from labor, it saves money from material, because you don't have to slather glue over the entire surface area of the outside of the drum, and then all the expense of cleaning up the glue and all of the applicators and whatever, just all the maintenance that goes on at the factory to keep the production going. So all of those costs have been foregone in the manufacture of this drum. But I am going to take it upon myself to really work on the craftsmanship and really step up the quality of this drum, keeping the same functional, not ideal, but still functional hardware, just to show you what craftsmanship alone can do and the role that it plays in the manufacturing of a quality drum. So I'm going to record this drum as is, just so you can see where we're starting from. Then I'm going to put nicer heads and hopefully snare wires on it, if I can find some that are going to work better than these. Then I will tear this thing apart, inflict all of my modifications, and put it back together, tune it back up the same way, same heads, the nice heads, not these. And then we will compare it and see how it goes. This should be fun. Okay, this is the stock shell. This is the snare bed on the butt side, extremely narrow and not very deep. Then as I turn the shell, you can see this huge gap, and then the edge touches the table again, and there's the strainer side. It's basically non-existent, the snare bed. As for the batter side, we have decent contact, and then see all the light here? This is not supposed to be that way. And then it is making contact again. So these are not flat planes. The plane of the bearing edge should be flat. So Jon Zoog had to flatten these planes basically before he could then cut new edges. So he did a lot of sanding to get them flat. And then he went on and cut edges. And here he's doing actually the counter cut. But the main cut is just a 45-degree cut, the basic cut. And when he was done, there was, of course, no snare bed because all of his sanding flattened that edge out. And this is the shrapnel left behind from the routing, and that's the stuff that often doesn't get sanded off on cheap drums, but should be sanded off. So I'm going to do that, but first I have to take the wrap off. And so I'm popping the grommet out there, and then I'm unscrewing the badge. I was going to take it off, but turns out once I got the screws out, it was actually stuck to the wrap, so it wouldn't come up. That's fine, no problem. Moving on. Took a putty knife to get under the adhesive on the seam there, and then once I got a good grip with my fingers, I could pull up carefully because I was going to reuse this wrap, so pulling up and away. And as I thought, no glue or any other adhesive on the drum, so it just came right off. And then this is the adhesive on the other side of the seam, again pulling carefully so I can reuse the wrap. I don't want to damage the wrap. And then I commenced to sanding the edge after the routing, starting with 80 grit sandpaper around the inside and then the outside. And I'm not going back and forth in one little spot and then another spot and then another spot. I'm actually just turning the shell and going around the outside so that the sanding and the impact of the sanding is even, so you don't have low spots. If you just do one spot at a time, you're going to wind up messing up the flat plane of the bearing edge. So I used 80 grit, and then you saw me using, I believe, 150 grit, and then I finished up with 220 grit, again around the inside of the edge and around the outside of the edge. And then once I was done with the edges, I did the inside of the shell. So I've got my sanding block here. Again, this is a coarse grit. You can actually see some of the debris coming off of that. And then finishing up again with the higher grit, of course. And then here I'm marking the location of the snare beds on the shell, and then taking a metal file, flat file, I carefully, because the wood is soft, I carefully kind of filed away at it to make the snare bed. And when you do this, man, just do a little bit and then check it and do a little bit and check it because it goes quickly, particularly with soft wood. And that's the finished product, nice and wide snare bed that will work well with a variety of tunings for the drum. This is Rotted Wood Restorer, a product by Bondo, and this is not part of normal drum construction, but because the wood is so soft and because I put a 45-degree edge on it, I wanted to support that edge. I don't really use super high tensions, but I just wanted the edge to last longer. And even though the wood is not rotted, it is soft, and that stuff will harden it. That's what it does. And here I have teak oil, a teak oil product that I'm going to do the rest of the shell with to seal the shell now that I'm done sanding. And this product, you just ladle it on nice and generously, really, really thick, because the wood just soaks it up. So you just ladle it on until it's done soaking it up, let it sit for about 30 minutes, wipe it off, and then wait 10 hours before putting a second coat on, which is what I did. It's shiny because it's wet. It doesn't actually make the wood shiny unless you do lots and lots of coats. I only did 2. Here, with the lugs, they had no foam, so nothing to stop the springs from making lots of nice noise. I wanted to make sure that I silenced them, so I put foam on the inside, and then once I repacked the spring in there, I put some more foam just for good measure. The strainer, nothing I can do for the lever itself, but I can lubricate with a little bit of lithium grease the threads for the tension adjustment knob, and I also used a couple of nylon washers to reduce friction between the knob and the top of the strainer, and that worked. amazingly well. It really works pretty well. Still doesn't really allow you to adjust much under tension, but it feels a whole lot better. And then I wanted to put the wrap back on, and I'm gluing it on this time, so it really kind of becomes part of the shell, at least in theory. And I lined it up by using the screw holes for the badge, which was still stuck to the wrap. And then I just went a little bit at a time once I got that going, being very, very careful to make sure that the holes line up properly. And that was a pain in the rear, by the way. It took some doing. Normally when you wrap a drum, you just wrap it and then you use the existing holes in the shell to drill through the wrap, you know, when you rewrap. But I rewrapped it with the same wrap, so I had to actually be really, really careful. But it worked out. Here I'm masking off the wrap so that it doesn't get overspray when I spray that seam with the adhesive. And then other than that, it's just to reassemble. Now look at this little box on the table there that I'm pulling washers out of. You see that? Those are large fender washers. I put 2 each at each screw for the lugs, which was about 1/3 of a pound of mass that I added to the drum, just reassembling it. I wanted to add more mass to increase the fundamental response of the drum, give it a little bit more body. And then putting the Aquarian heads, the Pure Sound snares, tuned it back up, and she is done. Okay, well, it's been 3.5 days now since I started this. So the drum's totally modified now. I will say that the oil inside, the oil rub finish, is probably not fully cured yet. It still has a pretty strong smell coming out the vent. And it says it's like ready to go in 10 hours, but honestly, 3, 4, 5 days for most oil finishes that you add. Really, it's helpful to get them fully cured. But for the sake of this video, it's done, and I'm going with it. But I haven't changed the complement of the hardware at all. The hardware is exactly what came on the drum. The only difference right now is I've got the heads and the snare wires that I used in that second clip, which was the stock drum with some Aquarian heads and some Pure Sound snare wires, 12 strand, because the snare bed was so narrow. And even though now it's no longer narrow, I'm still using the same snares just for the sake of consistency. The drum's tuned the same way it was in those other clips. Let's take a listen. Snares off first. I'm beating the crap out of it for a reason. I'll tell you in a second. Actually like a little bit of rattle, the white noise. But now I can dial it in the way I want, because the snare response is appropriate. Okay. Thoughts. First of all, I can smell the oil smell that's coming out the vent. The badge and the grommet are over on this side instead of like over here somewhere where in a normal positioning of the strainer, it would be visible to the audience. And Griffin apparently follows a different convention, and so on this side instead you have this lovely seam. So that notwithstanding, two big observations. One, the drum is brighter overall, the overall tone. And I'm not talking the snare response. The snare response on the previous examples was bright. The wires themselves were bright. But the tone of the drum that was behind the wires supporting it, much darker, much mellower, much less complex. Now the drum, it's a much brighter drum, but still wood. That's one. Two, I can get the snare response that I want. I can tighten these things up. Or nice and loose. Now the strainer kind of stinks. I've got to drop it to really loosen it. So now I can adjust the snares to make them loose, rattly, tight, whatever. If I was going to use this drum like on an ongoing basis and keep it, which I might keep it, I don't know. I actually kind of enjoy playing it, but I would replace the snare strainer and the butt because this little stamped piece of steel that pinches the ribbon here that's holding the snare wires on, it just bends under pressure and you can't tighten it up enough that it will not keep slipping. So it doesn't have a good grip on the snare wire. So the tighter that I go with this, the more they start to slip and loosen up anyways. And that's a function of the lame hardware. Secondly, the lugs, I would replace the lugs because at the tension that I have right now, and I've got on my TuneBot 265 on the top head and 380 on the bottom head. And that 380, I'm pretty sure is already starting to bend a little bit. The folded sheet metal that makes the outside of these lugs, it's kind of holding them together. And the fact that there's no boss on the casting of the lug, since they're not cast, that boss normally would fit inside the holes and would hold it in place, and then the screws would just affix it to the shell. Here, the screws are carrying the weight, so you've got a soft wood with pressure pulling one way or the other, depending upon the tension of the heads, and those threads are pretty sharp, and they're just going to kind of cut in. The sharpness of the threads pushing against the wood, it really means there's very little surface contact, little surface-to-surface contact with the wood, so all of that force, whichever way it's being pulled, is being pushed on really narrow threads. It's sort of like little knife blades, and they're just cutting through the wood. And eventually, these lugs are going to be slipping around depending upon the tension that you use. They're not meant for professional use. That's just the problem with the hardware itself. The hoops, part of the lightweight sound that this thing still has is the hoops. The hoops are the lightest weight, lightest gauge steel or whatever that I have ever used. I actually had one other drum. It was an SPL labeled drum that was also no doubt a stencil drum from not what they're making now, but from probably 10, maybe 15 years ago, that also had an incredibly lightweight hoop. And I am certain that if I were to look at this carefully, I would see that under tension, this portion, or maybe should I say the top portion, this portion is lower than in between. So at the point where those key rods are pulling, I have no doubt the hoop is giving a little bit and certainly will over time. So I would replace the lugs, the strainer in the butt, and I get heavier hoops, at least 1.6 millimeter, which I really like. Some people don't. They want 2.3s. That's fine. But I would put a hoop that can handle practical tension, useful, common tension on the drum, and you'll get more stable tuning, and with the lugs not slipping and cutting into the shell and all that kind of stuff. You'll get stable tuning over time. It'll be a more reliable drum. But sonically, It's still a lightweight drum, still a lightweight shell, even though it's a little bit more rigid now and more reflective, the inside. It has a little bit more mass. I did add those washers to it, which is only like 1/3 of a pound, but it did put some mass on it and try to increase the fundamental a little. I'll have to go back and listen to the recording and see how much of a difference that is. There might be a little bit more beef in the bottom end, but probably not significant. I can always dial that in with EQ though, as can you, whether you're playing live or recording or something. Just add the bottom that you want. But it is a much better sounding snare. It's much easier to tune. The snare response is significantly different. Now, one thing to consider is that this is the setup that I was using as far as the heads and the wires that I was using before, and that's why I'm using them now. It's always interesting when you do these kind of modification comparisons. You know, you try to capture the drum the way it was, you kind of tune it up, make it sound as good as you can, and then you modify it, and for the sake of comparison, you want to use the same heads, the same wires, the same tuning, the same miking. You want to do all of that. But now that the drum is different and it sounds different, I want to do different things with it. I want to maybe use different heads and tune it differently, and I want to put 20-strand snares on it, not 12-strand. So all of those changes that I would make because the drum sounds the way it sounds now, those are just personal preference things. For the sake of comparison, I've just duplicated what I did before. I'm not arguing this is an awesome sound and this is what this drum ought to sound like. To me, I would actually probably put a dot head on it, or maybe a double ply head to kind of mellow out some of the lightness and brightness characteristic that a poplar shell has because of its lightweight. You know, so I would do different things to it. But for the sake of comparison, I've kept everything the same. So I hope that that makes sense. And I hope that you can tell the difference. I think you can tell the difference between the snare response here and the snare response before. And at the beginning, with the snares off, I was hitting it pretty hard. Why? Well, because when I did that before, the snare wires, even the pure sound snare wires, were bouncing against the bottom. In my mind, I was thinking the design of the snare strainer doesn't allow for it to drop far enough. Well, that's actually not true. I think it was just because the snare beds were so insignificant that it was, you know, not clear of the snare wires, I guess. I'm not really sure, but it's behaving now the way I would expect it to behave. And this snare strainer, God love them, even though I put I lubricated it and put these nylon washers on, it does make the manipulation of the knob a lot smoother and more enjoyable, but the lever itself is it just grinds. So, did I say this thing had cheap hardware? Yeah, I think I did. Anyway, so with some fit and finish, some elbow grease, you too can make your $40 snare drum sound a lot better. And by the way, I didn't say this at the beginning, but I don't really recommend that you go buy the cheapest snare drum you can find and then put some effort into making it sound good. Because like I say, if I was going to keep this, I would replace all the hardware with hardware that I could rely on that's going to hold tuning and it's going to be durable and reliable and more enjoyable to operate. But the point of this was simply to show you that part of the expense, a significant part of the expense of a quality instrument, beyond anything superfluous in the way of finishes and exotic materials, is really just taking all the steps necessary to dial it in to get it to where it's going to tune and respond and sound like you want your instrument to sound. So I hope that is useful to you. Thanks for checking out this video, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks.